Good afternoon. My guest is Austin King. He is an author, former engineer and builder in Sault Ste. Marie. In fact, he built the Baptist Church on Colson Avenue and the Jewish Synagogue on Bruce Street. And we're going to talk about that in another program. And he's here today as his subject is Francis H. Clergue. And I believe this is going to be the career of Francis H. Clergue and his lifestyle here in the Soo. And I think a lot of our viewers have heard of Mr. Clergue as the founder of modern industrial Sault Ste. Marie. But Mr. Clergue, I understand, had a very bizarre career right here.
Very bizarre, Grace. And I would like to quote from Donald Eldon, one of his biographers. I think this puts it better than anyone possibly could. There came to light the bizarre story, stranger than one would dare to put in a novel, of a man who unquestionably was a great entrepreneurial genius. Inasmuch as no primary material has been examined, and since this account is based on secondary sources and on one interview with a close relative of Francis Clergue, no attempt is made here to explain this man's every action. Well, Francis H. Clergue was born in Brewer, Maine. That's near Bangor. That was in 1856. Now, he was a man of tremendous courage and determination. We know of boxers who've been knocked to the canvas 2 or 3 times, got up to continue and win their fight. Francis Clergue was knocked down 10 times and got up to carry on. And he would always shake off his failures and come back with more courage than, it's just amazing the courage that man had. And then it came to the point where he realized his dream here in Sault Ste. Marie. That's overlooking the hill. We see Mr. Clergue himself looking from the house he built later, viewing the many industries for which he was responsible.
Now, maybe we can learn some of his early ventures then, if you wouldn't mind.
His early ventures were many and varied. He began his career as a lawyer, with a great talent for promotion. Well, for a start, he began a street railway. But after he got it going, he got the expansion fever. It was a fever that he contracted very frequently and regularly over the years. Well, upon expansion, the street railway, it was combined with a power development. Well, it lost money for the investors. That was knockdown number 1.
10 of them too, eh?
Oh, yes. And next was a huge summer resort in Maine with a railway up a mountain and a steamboat cruise that took people to Nova Scotia. Disaster number 2. Well, next was a pulp mill. It was near Bangor. Again, over expansion and near collapse. Well, others salvaged it and froze out Mr. Clergue. This was followed by an even more chilling adventure. He had ice cut from the Penobscot River to be shipped to New York City. And where do you think it went?
Down the drain?
Down the drain.
Yeah.
Well, that was knockdown number 4. Well, next came a shipyard and dry dock venture in Mobile, Alabama, financed with capital from Great Britain, by the way. But failure number 5 knockdown.
He must have been running out of backers right about now. He's tried just about everything.
Well, yes, just about. Well, that's when he went farther afield. The next was the most bizarre, I think, and adventurous of all. In far-off Persia, now Iran, familiarly known to us, it appears he heard of grand opportunities. So in 1888, with $25,000 of investors' money in his pocket, he set out for Europe. Well, he planned to meet the Shah of Persia. But the Shah was winding up a tour of Russia with the Tsar, and they would finish up in St. Petersburg. Well, Clergue was traveling by caravan across the desert of Persia, Iran, on his way to meet the Shah in St. Petersburg. Well, he came across a pool of black on the desert, oil. Well, he negotiated with some high-ranking official of Persia, and he gained a 25-year exclusive franchise for the petroleum. Now, in addition, he was granted franchises for railway construction, telephone systems, indigo production, and sugar manufacture for 100 years.
Good grief. That actually should have set him up for the rest of his life then.
Well, he was riding high. Now, he was only 33, but he was really out of his class in the court of Imperial Russia and in the international intrigue of Europe and the Near East. He went to St. Petersburg to close this deal for the franchises with the Shah, but on his arrival, he learned that he'd been outmaneuvered by the Russians. Prince Clergue, who was the Russian minister to Persia at the time, he had already obtained documents giving all the rights to Russia instead. Well, Clergue departed for home empty-handed, out the $25,000 of investors' money. That was knockdown number 6.
I was going to say he'd tried just about everything, water, oil, pulp, whatever, and that would, I guess, finish him after that, knockdown under number 6.
Well, that would finish any ordinary man.
Yeah,
but
right.
Clergue was not an ordinary man. He had tremendous determination and tenacity, and that kept him going. It was in no time that he was into venture number 7. In this, he tried to promote mining enterprises. Well, they flopped. Knocked down 7. Well, he seemed to be down and out for good. Well, that's not so. He got himself employed then by a group of investors somehow, and he was traveling in northern Ontario to examine various possible sites for hydroelectric plants. Well, en route to Fort William on the CPR, he overheard some gossip that along the way there was a possible chance of picking up a power site, abandoned and half-finished. And this was only gossip at the time. But he, being an alert man, he arrived in a place called Sault Ste. Marie. In no time at all, he picked up the option, contacted his backers in Philadelphia.
He still had backers, did he?
How? It's only his amazing persuasiveness was able to convince backers at this time that he still had a going venture. Well, then as I say, it was only his courage and his determination that really carried him through. But he had many detractors. Now, I should mention here not only his genius as a promoter, but his amazing ability as an inventor. After the power plant was completed, then of course he had to have a use for his power, which immediately he built a pulp and paper mill, realizing the vast resources back of Sault Ste. Marie. Well, the biggies in the pulp and paper industry thought they were going to squeeze out this newcomer, and they did everything. They dropped the price, did everything they could to get rid of him. But no, sir. That's where his inventive genius came in. And it was an invention by which he could dry the pulp, which when they would ship it wet, it was very costly and would rot. But his process dried it out, and in no time at all, he beat all the competition. He had markets open up in Europe and even in the Orient. And orders were pouring in, just so great that they could scarcely handle them. Well, you know, Clergue was a handsome man of imposing deportment. I should mention here in 1937, when I first arrived in the Sioux on the first occasion, I spoke to an elderly merchant on his store in Queen Street, and I asked him about Clergue. Oh, he said, oh yes, Clergue. He was the most amazing word painter of his time. And, well, that you can believe, a word painter. Well, my retort to that really is, he may have been a word painter, but I don't think any word painter ever gave so unselfishly of his labor and talents to provide jobs and establish industries with small reward to himself.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I thought Donald Eldon, as a reviewer, put it very well. He said of F.H. Clergue that his aim was not so much to build a fortune for himself as to gain the satisfaction of making a wilderness hum with industry. Well, you know, his friends and supporters really felt that he deserved that house on the hill. In 1902, he had the grand house finished. And from here he could look out over his really mammoth achievements. He named it Montfermier.
What would that mean now? What Montfermier? Why that name?
Well, Montfermier is Mont for hill and fermier for farmer occupant. It seems that Mr. Clergue liked to be known as the occupant on the hill. He was a Huguenot stock. His father was a barber and a wig maker. He who had emigrated from France to Bangor, Maine, during the last century.
Now, where's the location of the former Montfermier in this city? Is it here?
At the west end of the street, yes, appropriately named Clergue Avenue. And it's always been known as on Moffley Hill.
Right,
Moffley Hill,
that's
right.
it.
Now, that the mansion was begun and finished in 1 year while Clergue pushed forward all his major industries in this part of Canada is really a measure of his amazing energy.
I was going to ask you if you have pictures of this, because I think
Yes.
at one time you did have pictures of the exterior of this beautiful big home.
That's right, yes. I have views of both the interior and the exterior.
Good.
And these are quite rare photographs, and they were passed to me by my brother-in-law, Earl Lyons, and I'm very indebted to him. Well, here we are. We have just driven up John Street in a horse and buggy,
Oh,
and we've climbed Moffley Hill, and we're approaching the mansion over the curving driveway. Mr. Clergue himself stands on the lawn. One of the ladies is probably his sister, Helen, after whom the Helen mine was named.
good grief.
And the other might be Gertrude, the name he gave one of the nickel mines he opened near Sudbury.
Now, what material was the mansion built of?
Of colorful red sandstone, the spoil from the digging of the canal. That was his first venture. And Mr. Clergue's origin is echoed in the architectural design. The mansard roof is a distinguishing feature of the Second Empire style, the Napoleon III of France period. It's rather interesting that the mansard roof was a device by which the architect originated in Paris to avoid higher taxes on buildings with eaves more than one story. Frenchmen of Paris have a way with them, so I'm told. Well, we get a better view here, especially of Mr. Clergue. And these pictures were taken, probably 7 or 8 years after the house was built. Mr. Clergue remained a bachelor all his life.
I'm sure he didn't have time for a family and a wife. He was too busy.
He was a very busy man in the industrial world. Yeah. He was a conservative dresser, quite in contradiction to his fame as a persuasive promoter. Well, you can look at the many chimneys in the house. There were 14 fireplaces. And here we approach the front entrance. The little girl in the group might be Miss Gertrude Clergue, a niece, and she may very well be alive today. And you can note here the servants' wing to the left. It's at an angle. It bends away from the brow of the hill beyond. And this is the canopy over the entrance, taken from another angle.
Gosh, that's really, really impressive. What about the interior?
Yes, we have a sketch, that's the best I could do, which is reconstructed from information given me by my friend Charlie Kirk, who is still a citizen of the Sioux and who was caretaker of the mansion. As I mentioned, the wing is at an angle, and rooms facing the hill are the dining room and the morning room. These had folding doors opening on the hall that could be folded back for special occasions to form one gigantic hall or ballroom. Well, everything Francis Hector Clergue undertook was on a grand scale. As a promoter, he entertained lavishly.
Was the entrance hall as large as the rest of the house? Was it as spacious?
Yes, it was probably 18 or 20 feet wide. Now, the furniture, as you can see, is quite opulent. Apparently, Mr. Clergue intended to spend the rest of his days here, operating the many industries that he had established. You can note the magnificent stairway that was built of the finest red mahogany. And the cabinet at the wall and the chairs beside are finely carved and turned. That grandfather clock standing at the left is a masterpiece of the clockmaker's art. Also a work of art was the stained glass window. Now, the light from it in the photograph is so strong that much detail is lost. So I made a sketch which will show it more fully. Mr. Clergue is here welcoming visitors just inside the main entrance. Now, let us say we go through to the tennis court overlooking the town. So here, the master of the mansion is standing with a companion on the court. Now, a distant view across the court. And another towards the hill around the corner of the house. Now, this one is a closer view on the hillside. Now, shall we go in again?
Yes, I was looking towards the dining room. Would that be closest to the kitchen or the servants' wing?
Yes, that's right. This is the dining room. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert in identifying period furniture. However, as it doesn't appear that Mr. Clergue was a collector of antiques, but my problem is much simplified. It was really on the advice of a collector of antiques, of antique furniture at the National Museum, that I gained this information. Christina Grant, she's an expert on furniture. The solid, beautifully carved and turned furniture in the dining room has features of the Elizabethan style. You can note the massive, bulbous table legs. Well, that was Mr. Clergue's style. Mr. Clergue built the paper mill buildings to last for years, for example. Well, we note in passing quickly the fine woodwork of the fireplace mantel, elaborately carved. Fine candle holders and pieces of china and bric-a-brac can be seen in the cabinet and the table. The ornate lampshade over the table, it really outdoes even a Tiffany. Fluted columns at the window, and the panel ceiling add an atmosphere of opulence created by Mr. Clergue, even though the Clergue enterprises were becoming financially shaky at this time. Well, shall we look opposite the hall? On the opposite side of the hall, we find the morning room. With the doors folded back, as mentioned, the combined room could seat 60 guests at one time. Features are the white fireplace of the Adams style, which are frequently found in historic houses of some 200 years vintage. The chairs are no special design, but you might note the interesting spirally turned rocker. And another chair with a straight back appears to be of mission oak. I happen to own one, very old and very uncomfortable, I should say. However, all of the Clergue chairs appear lived in daily use. Well, you might note the prominent plaster molding in the ceiling, and the very popular picture mold at the time. Well, let's look in at a party in progress. Mr. Clergue liked to play and amuse himself at his white grand piano. He could be playing a Strauss waltz. He shared the house with his sisters, his mother and his father, and brother Bertrand for a number of years. He shared his success with his family. Another brother, Ernest, unfortunately died a few years early when, as manager of the Michipicoten mining operations, he collapsed from overstrain after packing canoe and gear over a portage while on a survey.
Boy, that must have been a tragedy for the family when industries were just really getting started. Now, the remaining members of the family, I'm sure, were comfortable in the big, fine house on the hill. And I understand there was a fine library just off the hall. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time to look into that library in this particular picture, or this particular time. But we will invite you back, if you wouldn't mind, Austin, to come back and give us another rundown on what happened afterwards. Like, we've got him established in the Sioux and his career prior to coming to the Sioux, and we'll find out more about Mr. Francis H. Clergue in another program. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Happy to.
Time to taste this, Jerry, because